this session is trying to identify a few key issues driven by Charity Commission guidance and what the Charity Commission is concerned about. So it's not going to cover your basic trustee duties. It's not going to give you a lowdown on charity law. But we will be running some smaller sessions, hopefully interactive, with sort of 20 or 30 people, more like a large meeting where we can have a proper interaction with you. So just to remember, your governing document is your key instruction book, and you are bound to continue to comply with it. So if you have any questions, the first place you should be looking is in your governing document. In particular, and it will come up often during this session, your charitable objectives, which are sacrosanct. So there have been a few relaxations which this session is intended to try and cover off. So without further ado, if we could have the first slide, please, Rachel. So I'm going to cover some issues, in particular solvency. That's been very pertinent over the last few months. Clearly, business models have changed entirely. Fundraising income has dried up in certain cases. So trustees are bound to look at their solvency. It's a high priority. Transparent and accountable governance is a theme the Commission is pushing hard, and James will dig into that and safeguarding in a little bit more detail as we go through. There are also a big focus linked to managing conflicts of interest in relation to relationships with connected organisations. The Commission mostly intervenes in charities because there are unmanaged conflicts of interest or there are issues in relation to public and private benefit. In other words, whether the associated organisation is getting an undue benefit. So we'll just touch on that. Risk management, again, always on the agenda and linked very much to transparent and accountable governance as to how you as trustees ensure your charity is operating effectively. Fraud has been a big issue recently. A number of our contacts, not necessarily our clients, have asked questions about fraud, how to manage risks from people working at home. There have been a number of horrific sort of ransomware attacks where your systems get locked out. So it's very important to make sure you've got policies, you've got appropriate IT solutions, and that your staff are appropriately trained to deliver it, or not to click on links. And the new Code of Good Governance, I think, is increasingly important in the charity world. It's being adopted by larger charities as a sort of benchmark and is endorsed by the Charity Commission. So again, there's a good tool for you to look at if you are considering a governance review or looking at your own governance. Rachel, can we have the next slide, please? So the Charity Commission has issued some guidance when COVID struck. They have been updating it as time goes on. The Charity Commission's message is still very much, and slightly controversially, that charities should be acting in a way that the public would expect, which James will touch on again in a little more detail. It's controversial because their duty is to maintain public trust and confidence. It's not to regulate the sector in relation to what the general public might expect. So there's a slight nuance there. So just to the guidance, clearly with lockdowns and social distancing, etc., holding meetings for charities has become very difficult. The government did introduce the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act and a number of related regulations, which were intended to end in December, but have now been extended to 31st of March 2021. They do apply to companies, charitable incorporated organisations and community benefit societies, but not necessarily to trusts, which shouldn't be problematic, but unincorporated associations. The regulations don't cover them, and we've faced a number of clients with disputes as to whether trustees have been appropriately reappointed at virtual meetings. The regulations do essentially allow companies, CIOs, to hold virtual members meetings and virtual trustees meetings. So it's designed to give you the flexibility, notwithstanding what your constitution or governing document actually says. Trustee meetings, there's always been an ability really to hold trustee meetings virtually. And the Commission has said even if your governing document doesn't specifically allow it, they will act flexibly, and so long as you record your decisions appropriately, they will not come down on you like a ton of bricks. So you can have virtual meetings, and it's better to have meetings and manage things properly, even if they're virtual, than just ignoring it and saying, well, we can't meet. So that's obvious. Other charity meetings are also permitted where you're delivering charitable services, but the guidance changes quite a lot depending on whether we're in tier 1, 2, 3, 4 or full lockdown. So you do need to check the specifics when it comes to that. The updated guidance also touches on and acknowledges that charity mergers and collaborations are increasingly important in this environment where a number of organisations are struggling. So points you to some guidance on that. Use of reserves and restricted funds. Well, reserves are always called sort of rainy day money, and I would suggest that this is the rainiest of rainy days. It allows you, and specifically gives you some guidance about how you should be thinking about using reserves, really to think about the long-term impact of using money today that you might have used in the future. And it's also talks about, again, linked to financial sustainability, about the possible need to stop certain services, to cut your costs, to look for other sources of income. But it's important to remember there are different type of reserves. Some are just designated funds where the trustees have said, we're going to put this aside for a particular project. And clearly, given the trustees imposed that obligation on themselves, they can release that obligation. But there are also restricted funds, and restricted funds are where a restriction has been imposed by another party, so a donor, for example. You'll need to think carefully about whether you can use those restricted funds for any other particular purpose. You can go back to the donor and ask them to release that funding, and a number of the sort of institutional donors and trusts and foundations have done exactly that. They've said, we gave you this money for this project, but we're happy if you use it for something else, something allied. And then there is permanent endowment, and clearly you will not be able to spend permanent endowment. And if your charity is facing some difficulty, really the only thing you can do with permanent endowment is to transfer it to another charity. So that's all quite technical, but you need to just identify what funds are subject to what restrictions. I'll touch on solvency. I've got a separate slide on that, and managing financial difficulties. But again, the Commission has issued some, or always had some guidance on managing financial difficulties, and it's worth a quick look over that. Charitable objectives, they're absolutely core to a charity. They are restrictive in the sense you can't do anything outside those objects. But many organisations will be going, can we run this project within our charitable objectives, usually because they've done a particular type of work, but quite often your objects are wider than the particular projects you run. So if you've got demand for your services that are slightly new or different, do look back at your objects, because you may well find there's sufficient room within them to run those projects, but you do obviously need to make sure that you can, whatever you do is within them. So they can cover related COVID projects. If you need to extend your objects, if your objects are too narrow for something you want to do, clearly you can go to the Charity Commission and ask for consent. You may also have to get a members' vote to approve that change, depending on what you are. The Charity Commission is sensible on that. They are keen to assist, and they will give you a swift response to it. They generally want you to have considered what the wider implications, the longer term implications of changing your objects would be, and they're likely to consent if that's a reasonably tangential to your existing activities. You can't change a charity established to promote sustainability into a charity that is going to advance health somewhere. You can't change an apple into a pear. So you will need to take a sensible approach to that. Serious incident reporting, again, they've issued some further guidance just to touch on the fact that if you had to close your office as a result of lockdown, that's not really a serious incident. So they have done some more examples of what they think is a serious incident and what they think is not a serious incident. We'll touch on serious incident reporting a bit later, but it remains a very important thing to keep your eye on, because the Commission get very upset if you haven't reported an incident, and you should have, and you're also, as trustees, obliged to confirm every year that you have reported all the serious incidences that may have arisen. Keeping people safe, I'm going to leave that to James as part of his, but it's still, again, it's still a priority for the Commission. Rachel, could we have the next slide? Fundraising appeals, again, the guidance touches on these. Obviously, there have been lots of emergency fundraising appeals, and they are just reminding you that any fundraising appeal must A, be within your objects, and B, don't inadvertently create such a restricted ask that you find it difficult to spend the money. It's quite common where there is an emergency for people to say, we want to do this particular thing, and sometimes they're lucky enough to get lots of money and find that they can't expend it properly, and then it's very difficult to release that restriction. You may have to return money to donors, which is an added complication. Support for trading subsidiaries. This is a little bit linked to working with a non-charity, but your trading subsidiary is generally not a charity. It sometimes does charitable activities. If it's doing charitable activities, it's perfectly okay for the charity to support it in doing the charitable activities. However, quite often they're not charitable, they're fundraising type activities. And in the current environment, lots of charities are finding that their subsidiaries are struggling because they can't carry out activities, etc. You need to think very carefully about whether you can continue to support that trading subsidiary. It is a financial investment that you are making into that charity, and you've got to have into that trading subsidiary, and you've got to have good reasons for doing it. So the Commission is again reminding us that any decision to support the trading subsidiary must be in the best interest of the charity. There's got to be some financial sense to it and some investment return. But again, they are emphasising that they realise what's happening out there, and there is some flexibility, perhaps a longer period of return for the investment to come good. Contracts, there have been a lot of questions about contracts and where we stand if we're not able to open our centre. What if we've got school trips booked into our to visit an attraction or a charitable activity, and it's very complicated. The answer is it's very complicated. One of the things that the Commission says is that you can take a view that you can return money to service users, for example, if that makes sense at the time. Usually people would say, well, you can't just give charity money away, and the Commission are emphasising that they don't think this is an ex gratia payment that needs Charity Commission consent. It's a commercial common sense thing to do. If your service users can't get the services, then you're entitled to return that money. There are concepts such as, is the contract subject to force majeure or frustration? In other words, it can't be performed, and how you should deal with that. In most cases, it is a sensible negotiation with the other party, but if you need some advice on that will depend very much on the contract wording. Working with a non-charity, again, this has been a focus for the Commission recently because they are concerned to ensure that charities deliver public benefit, and that any private benefit that accrues to a non-charity you're working with is only necessary and ancillary to delivering the charitable benefit. all relationships with non-charities, commercial participators, big companies that are trying to fund you, or you perhaps funding companies that can deliver some aspect of your charitable purposes. They emphasize, again, it must pursue your charitable objectives, must be in the best interests of the charity. You should be identifying the risks of this relationship, not only commercial, but reputational. That conflicts of interest need to be carefully considered and managed, and that you have a proper agreement in writing with that organisation. So, Rachel, could I have the next slide, please? So, just in time, well, actually, it was in November last year, the Charity Commission did pull together some of its guidance to, and I think this is what really reflects where their real concerns are. So they pulled together this take 5-minute guides. And again, I would suggest if you're uncertain about something, this is a good place to start. Obviously, financial oversight is very important. Making sure you're pursuing your objects, you've got appropriate internal controls, you're identifying risks, and that importantly, again, that you document decisions. This also comes out in the good decision-making guidance. Having a detailed board minute explaining why you took a decision, and on the basis that decision is within the bounds that a reasonable board of trustees could have made, will be your first line of defense if anyone comes and says, why did you do that? So it's really, really important to make sure you have appropriate documentation. Achieving the charity's purposes, again, I think we've probably touched on this, but it's emphasizing watch out for mission drift. Don't go and do things that you're not entitled to do in accordance with your charitable objectives. Good decision making is, again, this is a rather useful piece of guidance, emphasizing your trustees' duties to pursue your charitable objectives, only to exercise the powers you rightly can, always to act in your charity's best interests, to make sure you have all the relevant information, that you take account of the relevant information and you ignore irrelevant information, that you manage conflicts of interest. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there are most of the interventions the Charity Commission make with charities are as a result of unmanaged conflicts of interest, where somebody's being paid or a third party is getting an undue benefit. And as I say, they will not interpose their own decision if the decision you reach is one within a reasonable boundary that a reasonable board of trustees would be able to make. Keep records, keep an eye on your governing documents, and do take advice if you feel you need it. Conflicts of interest, again, I think I'm going to touch on this. It's a fairly detailed topic, but you are, as trustees, are fiduciaries. You should make sure that you identify and or declare any conflicts of interest. You're obliged to seek to remove that conflict of interest or at least manage it effectively. And you should have a policy about conflicts of interest and record decisions that are reached when considering them. So then what to file with the Charity Commission? Again, they're talking about serious incidents and what you need to file with them, but also that you need to keep the register of charity trustees, etc., up to date, that you must continue to file annual returns and annual reports. So I think that was all on that, please, Rachel. And then solvency, and this is obviously very important at this moment. Just a quick reminder, the tests are an organisation is insolvent if its liabilities exceed its assets, or if it can't pay its liabilities as they fall due. So the key issue is if you have some financial difficulties, you should be having regular meetings. You should make sure you've got up-to-date financial information produced recently. You need to meet more regularly than you would normally, and you should take advice. The Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act has been a little bit helpful in this, mainly for the economy as a whole. It introduced some long-awaited new provisions in relation to moratoriums for companies that are undergoing restructuring. But it's also suspended the application of statutory demands and winding up petitions. So you're less likely to get wound up during this period. The one thing it has suspended is wrongful trading. Now, this is where trustees or directors of a company know that the company is going to go into insolvent liquidation and don't do everything they possibly can in the interests of creditors. So when you become insolvent, or in fact, when you are in the foothills of insolvency, what we call the twilight zone, where you look forward and you see cash flow projections that are less certain than you would like, you need to take account of the creditor's interests. Your obligations are no longer to keep delivering your charitable objectives. You've got to think about how your actions will impact upon creditors. So for wrongful trading, usually trustees or directors could be held personally liable for any increase in liabilities as a result of their actions and their decisions. So you can be made personally liable. What this does, the Act, is to suspend wrongful trading until 30th of April 2021. That's very helpful, because the idea is that trustees have a bit more certainty that they won't be held personally liable for continuing to trade. However, it is not an absolute protection for trustees. There is this thing called misfeasance, where a liquidator can go and argue that the decisions were still, notwithstanding that they weren't wrongful trading, that they were still not in the interests of the charity. So you do need to be a bit careful about continuing to trade, notwithstanding your financial position. Again, if you have got advice and detailed records of decisions, then that's very helpful for defending an allegation. It's also worth just watching out for things like preferences, which are where people are knocking on your door asking for bills to be paid, and you prefer one creditor over another. It is possible for a liquidator to seek to reverse that transaction. Ditto with a transaction at an undervalue, and this applies possibly where you're doing mergers. So you need to think about, you can't just give away your assets and not get somebody to assume the responsibility for the creditors as well. So you need to be quite careful about that. So I think that is me for now. If I may, I'll pass over to James.
Well, good to see you all, or not see you all, and I hope we will be back together in person. I just wanted to give some background, because governance hasn't always had the importance and prominence that it has now. Why is it so much more prominent and so much more important now? Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. One, the regulator, Baroness Stoll has driven forward a vastly more regulatory charity commission, and the commission is getting more and more prescriptive about how you deal with governance. So in the old days, charities had a great deal of latitude as to how they govern themselves. Now it's much more moving towards a highly regulated and compliant arrangement. Just to give you an example, following their June alert on some governance issues, they're now asking some charities, when did your trustees last have external training? So we're obviously finding we're spending a lot of time doing that to make sure that people are able to meet that requirement. And similarly, policies, they're now actually asking people, can they see their policies? And take an example that Andrew's just been talking about, conflicts of interest. Clearly, it's always been important to manage conflicts of interest, but the Commission now has a guidance which rather prescriptively says exactly what they expect to see in a conflict of interest policy. I'm actually quite keen on their pressure in this area, because in my experience, trustees are pretty resistant at recognizing conflicts of interest, or more particularly recognizing conflicts of duty. And when we do governance reviews with people, what's been revealed, and then one does a little internet search on some of the trustees, people just haven't taken a broad view about what needs to be disclosed. So there is a long way to go still. So I feel happy about some of this increased regulation. But like Andrew, I share a deep concern about this idea that charities are there to meet public expectations rather than deliver public good. The Baroness is leaving in February, but Helen Stevens, the Chief Executive, has made it pretty clear that she's going to follow the same line. She said recently, charity is an expression of the willingness of people to give time and money. Well, as far as I'm concerned, charity is about achieving your objects. It's not an expression of people's willingness to give time and money. And indeed, quite a number of charities don't really see that as a core part at all. And so the first issue is you do need to take it more seriously than we perhaps previously did. So you are going to be held to a higher standard. The second is that I think we're all becoming more aware of a range of issues and that need to be thought about by a charity. And so we've just had the Code of Governance go through its third revision, and it very substantially increases the duties on trustees in the field of diversity and in the field of integrity of trustees. So a steady movement forward in this area, a steady improvement of standards, a steady increase of the level of regulation. Could I have the next slide, please, Rachel? So when we talk about these core issues where there are movement, equality, diversity, and inclusion, obviously the impact of things like Black Lives Matter has been great. More and more charities are realizing that this has to be front and center at board level as well as within the organization. We've talked quite a bit about serious incident reporting, this obligation of you to report serious incidents to the Commission. The reporting of serious incidents went up by 47% last year. Now you might think it's a good idea for you not to have had to report serious incidents, but the Commission is beginning to keep statistical evidence about how many reports people make. And if you are an outlier organization who hasn't reported any serious incidents, you're quite likely to get a tart letter saying you haven't reported any serious incidents. Most organizations of your size and type have reported 3 in the last 2 years or whatever. Why haven't you done any? The Commission's concerns are also very much affected by media attention. If anything you're doing attracts negative media attention, however wrong you feel that is, you're going to have to think about reporting it as a serious incident. And in the area of public confidence, they are pushing forward with much higher standards of personal behavior among trustees. So in the past, people largely felt that what happened to a trustees outside their trustee role was irrelevant. Increasingly, it's seen as important. Next slide, please, Rachel. So this is taken from the Charity Commission's last annual report. And what they're keen to emphasize is how much more regulatory work they're doing. If you look at something like whistleblowing, they've been strongly encouraging people to whistleblow. They've got a special line for people to call. So what's the implication for you? Well, the implication is, when did you last look at the way you handled whistleblowing issues internally? Have your policies been updated so that you don't find yourself at the wrong end of a Charity Commission investigation? Statutory inquiries, you'll see that there's a 17% increase of statutory inquiries over 1 year. Now, it's a big an increase in 1 year, but if you look back 4 or 5 years, this is probably a 10 or 11-fold increase in statutory inquiries. And statutory inquiries, which are published on the Commission's website, are extremely damaging to the reputation of charities involved. And if you are involved in one, you will find that the internet records the fact that you were involved in one for a staggeringly long period after you have dealt with any issues that actually arose. Rachel, next one, please. So I referred earlier to a regulatory alert. This was one that came out in June following problems at RNAB. It is a very useful restatement of their key concerns. They seem to feel that there are particular problems in what they call complex charities. Well, by complex charities, all they really mean is that there's a separate board of trustees and an executive or staff team, which covers most of you attending this seminar. So most of you will fall within what they call complex charities. And what they're worried about is whether the board has really got a good control, a good understanding, a good communication with its staff. These are obviously important issues, but they are going to be checking, particularly if you're a larger organization, as to whether you're actually doing it and whether your board has looked at and taken into account this June guidance. Again, something we've been doing with boards is putting in place material which shows that they have complied. At the next slide, please, Rachel. So what they're looking for is, they say, transparency and accountability. Transparency is being ramped up. Your annual reports are going to be analyzed in yet more detail. People will be able to do much more research on you using the Commission's website. But they're also particularly concerned about this communication between staff and trustees. I think you need to think about how this actually happens in your organization. So in some organizations, it's quite broadly spread with trustees across the board becoming involved in this. In others, it's tightly focused through the chair, who relates to the chief executive, and there is a kind of hourglass shape in the communications. Do think about, when you're doing your governance reviews, as you're supposed to do each year, how this communication is working and whether the committee structure fits well in with this. They want to see very clear focus on risk management, and it's important to focus in it, but it's also very important to minute it and be able to demonstrate that you've focused on it. So if you're thinking about how you record material in your minutes, remember that these may at some stage be looked at by the regulator. So write them in a way that demonstrates your concern with risk management and your ways of looking at it. There are some tensions in what's going on here. So one of the problems at RNIB was a lack of skills in the areas that were being dealt with on the board and on the committees dealing with those areas. There is a tension here between the equality and diversity principle that is being pushed and the need to attract and hold on to your trustee board people with appropriate skills. So that's going to need some thought about your recruitment processes as to how you square the circle between getting highly experienced individuals and getting a really diverse board. They're also looking to see how boards deal with and learn from problems. One of the most important issues is recording and understanding the implications of near misses. Serious incidents are generally things that have gone wrong, but you can learn as much from something that nearly went wrong but didn't quite. And there is an understandable reluctance sometimes of staff to surface to the board things that didn't actually result in a disaster. So I think you need to find ways of ensuring that the learning inherent in those sorts of incidents is surfaced. Similarly, complaints and internal audit are all both important sources of knowledge about how things are going. Do remember that the Commission will take it very amiss if the way in which complaints can be made is not front and center on your website. We done governance reviews recently, and one of the first things we've had to say to people is it took me a very considerable period of time to find out how to make a complaint, and the Commission would see that as a major governance problem. Next slide, please. Things that they're particularly asking when they come to charities to say, have you taken notice of our regulatory alert, is how did your induction work for trustees? And we include an attachment of suitable induction papers to these notes. And whether you're providing external training for trustees occasionally on key areas. That may be accounting, it may be the service area you deliver, or it may be governance itself. Structures and delegation, they're going to be looking at terms of reference and how clear the delegatory routes are, and looking at looking over compliant policies across a range of areas. So, for example, conflicts of interest. Do you not only have a policy, is there evidence in the minutes that it's followed, and is the policy compliant with the Commission's guidance? And at the bottom, there is a power for the Commission to use very substantial steps against an organisation, including removal of trustee, closure and intervention. So it is important that these areas are kept front and centre of the board's attention. Next slide, please. So they're quite likely in a preliminary investigation to ask for you to send them the policies I've listed here. In terms of governance, they're looking for governance committees or nomination committees. Many of you won't have these, or will have them only operating occasionally. Certainly, it's linked to the whole board's self-awareness of its own governance capabilities, and too many boards are not doing as yet the annual board self-assessment that is a requirement of good practice, and very importantly, the external review of governance, which should, for organisations of over £1 million, take place every 3 years. We find when we do these for organisations that they're often extremely valuable, give people a chance to surface issues which have not been surfaced in the often very packed agendas of an organisation, and to take a fundamental look at the way governance is handled. And the code is very clear that organisations should have these external reviews every 3 years. Next slide, please. So absolutely at the centre of the Commission's concerns is safeguarding, and still not fully understood throughout the sector, particularly among trustees who've been involved in safeguarding in other spheres, is that safeguarding doesn't mean what it means in the law, i.e. protecting vulnerable adults and children. As far as the Commission is concerned, safeguarding covers pretty well everyone you come in contact with, and they will see as a breach of safeguarding unhappiness or concerns raised by anyone who comes in contact with the organisation or its behaviours. This refers back to my earlier discussion about complaints procedures, and obviously a range of other policies are very important for managing this. They are extremely concerned about safeguarding, and as I said, whenever one looks at it again and looks at their guidance, it appears to is expanded. So to take an example, the behaviour of staff that gave rise to disciplinary procedure was never historically considered an issue for the Charity Commission. Now, if it involves a senior member of staff, it's quite likely to be regarded as a safeguarding issue and possibly requiring a serious incident report. So a big expansion of responsibilities here. Rachel, if I could have another. So what do you need to do to show you're being compliant, to show the Commission you're taking safeguarding seriously, as well as obviously to do it properly? You need to look at your procedures. The board needs to have visibly check these procedures, and importantly, to check how they're implemented, because procedures in themselves don't do anything if they're not actually being used on the ground. Quite a lot of larger organizations have commissioned independent reviews of their safeguarding, and they can be very useful. I'm a chair of a charity, and we found the independent review of our safeguarding that we did extremely useful and very supportive of what we were doing. So in other areas, where can you get feedback on safeguarding? Well, I think that exiting procedures and interviews with departing staff often yield very important information about the culture of the organization. And certainly for the most senior staff, I think there is an argument for involving trustees in these exit procedures, because sometimes they surface difficulties at the very top of the executive, which have not been apparent to trustees. And I think
James,
that
I've got a question that's
yes.
quite a good one. So serious incident reporting, so a comment first, unfortunately it's likely to be more serious illness or death. How to judge what should be reported, and is it always in senior staff? And there's another one afterwards once you've done that one.
Serious incident reporting, theoretically, is simply, does the incident in question have a serious impact on your organization? So if I can take an example, if there was an allegation of sexual harassment or bullying against the chief executive, that if it reached the media would be likely to have a serious reputational impact on the organization. If you had a fight between two people in your warehouse, and that resulted in a safeguarding incident, that's much less likely to damage your reputation. So there is a question of judgment. The Commission has set out a series of examples in its own guidance. We spend quite a bit of time talking to people not only about what to report, but how to report it, because one of the issues here is that the Commission feel quite comfortable about releasing to the media things that have been reported as a serious incident, and there are ways to mitigate that issue. So I'm afraid it's not clear. It's something that each board has to make a decision. Now, one small piece of reassurance is that if there is clear evidence that the full facts about a possible serious incident were brought to the board, and the board said, in our context, that's not really serious, the Commission are not likely to beat you up if you haven't reported it, unless the decision was extremely flawed. And you said there was a second question?
Yes, so the
James,
other one...
James, can I just add in on that? I think if you are a charity running a care home in the current environment, clearly this has been disastrous, and I don't think the Commission, you would want to report a serious incident to say, we've had a higher than usual death rate in our care home, but given the circumstances, inability to get PPP, very vulnerable people being looked after, I don't think that that's going to roll out a larger regulatory response, because they do see what the context is. So I think just in case that was the side that the question was coming from. Sorry to...
Thank you, Andrew.
And then the second question was, can you give an example of expectations of higher standards of personal behaviour by trustees?
Well, I'm still absorbing that. I mean, it's in the code. I think what I would say is to tackle this another way around. I think you need, when you recruit staff, to set standards for them. And so you also need to do that for trustees. And I think you need to have a code of conduct for trustees, which sets out what you think is appropriate for your organization in terms of their behavior and how it may impact on you. So today we have organizations of hugely varying sorts, but I'm thinking about behavior by a trustee which might have reputational damage, even though it didn't particularly relate to their activities. I was involved in a national charity which managed some very large assets, and someone came under very significant criticism for the way they'd handled an insolvency in a company, and the board took the view that they couldn't afford to have someone whose reputation was that badly damaged in connection with probity on their board. So it's difficult to say, but I think each board does need to think about it. And just going back to conflicts of interest, one of the greatest difficulties is surfacing these things among a group of people who often know one another and have good relationships. You are going to have to exclude the individual and have a proper discussion about whether this is an issue that is a real concern or not. If you don't exclude the individual, you won't have a proper discussion. Thank you. Finally, I'm involved in housing associations as well as charity, and one of the key questions that constantly gets asked by the regulator is how do you verify that the information that you're being given about issues like safeguarding is correct? So I think you all have to think about that and how you can reassure your boards that there aren't any lacunas in what's going on. And I think, Andrew, this is the point I hand back to you.
Great. Thank you, James. Rachel, can we have the next slide? I'm not going to dwell on this because actually you will see from this slide there is a substantial sort of mirroring as to the Charity Commission's view on how you manage risks, mirroring what they expect in relation to safeguarding. So ongoing regular reviews of the processes, how you're identifying risks and working between strategic and operational risks, what strategy have you got in place, what mitigation arrangements have you got in place, and having them clearly documented. The responsibility for clear and reporting arrangements. That is obviously making sure there is the feedback loop from the staff and that the trustees have proper oversight. I won't dwell on serious incident reporting as well. Clearly very, very important to embed policies and procedures so that they work. It's all well and good having a document that says we've got this as a risk management strategy, but you need to train people in it, train staff. Again, I touched on this about cyber attacks and phishing attacks and ransomware attacks. We've had endless renewals of our training in this area because it is such a significant business risk. We are required to do training on a virtually monthly basis. So it is important you can demonstrate not only you have the policy that it has been applied and people understand it, and to embed a speaking up culture. This is a bit like the complaints policy, but making it sure that the internal whistleblowing or complaints process is recognised. Rachel, next slide, please. Fundraising responsibilities. I think this is probably where the Charity Commission starts with its higher standards. Everybody will recall the fundraising scandals of a few years ago, and the sort of press and media response to that. And they were very conscious that, again, sometimes trustees didn't really know what the charity was doing by way of fundraising. And there were the sort of aggressive chuggers on the streets demanding money from people, or multiple invitations to donate from a charity to potentially vulnerable people. And that scandal, I think, very much opened the Commission's eyes to say, hang on, we're not making sure that this works properly. Clearly, this is in the sort of professional end of the sector. Most, these are the big charities that use very commercial approaches to raising funding. So I think that this is really where the standards are driven from. So trustees are expected to set and monitor the approach to fundraising, identify the risks in whatever fundraising plan you have, and understand how it's being delivered on the ground. Commercial partners and professional fundraisers, there are now obligations to have particular provisions in those agreements and make sure that they're being complied with. Considering the impact on donors, supporters and the general public is where the Commission really focus, in the sense that that is the thing that will damage public trust and confidence in charities if there are over-aggressive fundraising methods. You now have to comply not only with Charity Law, the 1992 Act, but the fundraising regulator standards, and clearly being open and accountable and reporting clearly on what you do. There is now an obligation to put in your annual accounts a statement as to how you go about fundraising. So very, very quick whiz through that, but I don't want to dwell on concepts that are reflected in what James has talked about already. And sorry, James, back to you again.
James, there are a couple of questions for you, actually, if you want to pick those up now.
Yes, that'd be good.
So the first one is, James says that governance reviews should happen every 3 years if your turnover is over 1 million per annum. Our turnover is less than this, but we have assets of over 5 million. What's our position?
The governance reviews should happen because they're useful. And I think the reason that they chose this arbitrary cut-off figure of 1 million is just the resources available, because there is a cost in when we or someone else conducts a governance review for them. So I think what I would be saying to a board is, are there issues you think it would be good to have a go at using a governance review? Because people use them very, very differently. Sometimes they're a broad-ranging look at across policies and compliance in a number of areas, but more usefully, they're about tackling particular issues that a board thinks it hasn't been able to take forward in its routine meetings. So you aren't required to do it by the code. You need to think about whether it would be useful, and you need to decide. Obviously, all charities need to be careful about the way they spend their money. Are we going to get good value from it? I would just say that historically, boards have underinvested in themselves, and they are the final responsible group in the organization. And if board is not operating well, if there are problems in its structure, the role of the chair, the composition of the board, or any of these other issues, then the organization will suffer, however good the staff team is. So it's worth thinking about, whatever your size is. But the rule is it's turnover at 1 million that triggers the obligation. Below that, it's a question for you to decide.
And then the other question is, if a beneficiary is not happy about a decision the trustee board has made and vocalises this to the board, should this be recorded as a complaint? And if so, should the beneficiary be informed that their complaint has been or will be recorded?
I think there's a difference between a disagreement about policy and a complaint. Generally, it's best to treat anything through a formal procedure, and you do need to think about your formal procedure and make sure it's actually workable. I've seen people have over elaborate complaints procedures, or ones that don't have a cutout in it. By a cutout, I mean an assessment at the beginning as to whether the complaint should be followed through, because occasionally you get people trying to misuse your complaints procedure. But if in doubt, it's generally better to use that process and to be able to demonstrate that there was a formal response, which hopefully will bring the discussion to an end, because the last thing you want is a continuing discussion or someone raising it in social media or elsewhere to carry on their campaign. Right, next slide. This is what the code says in its key headings. I won't go through it. As I've said, the areas, if you were to spend some time looking at it, where we've got biggest change are displaying diversity and acting with integrity, where there is a much more prescriptive set of rules than there previously were. Next slide, please. So all I'd say here is that all my life I've been a trustee, and the effectiveness as a trustee that one has is absolutely closely linked to induction. And this is a very difficult period in which to induct trustees. And I think you need to think particularly carefully about how you induct and support trustees during this period if you want to have an effective board. Next slide, please. Boards are still, in my view, doing quite well during lockdown, but we're going to begin to run into problems because you can do a lot digitally, but a board only works well if there's a relationship of trust and confidence between board members, if there's a genuine partnership to drive the organization forward, if board members develop an understanding of the organization through meeting staff and visiting. So you need to think in a digital world, how are you going to overcome these barriers to board members becoming a proper part of the process? So I think that breakout sessions and socials, sharing of more personal information, which would normally take place when people stood around at the beginning of a meeting having a coffee or had a drink afterwards. You need to find ways of replicating that in a digital world. You need to think about, how do you get conversations going? So should there be sessions where there are staff perhaps without the chief executive? Should there be board only sessions? My own view is that most larger charities find it helpful to have a board meeting with various staff in attendance, to follow that with a short session with the chief executive only with the trustees, so any sensitive issues can be discussed there, and to follow that with a short session with only the trustees and no staff present. So I do think that you've got to think about how you're going to make your boards work during this very difficult period. And at that point, I will stop and thank you all for attending. If anybody's got further questions that we don't get to deal with here, we will try and respond to them. And please, our phone numbers are on these slides. We're very, very happy to chat to people on the phone. It makes a break from endlessly going at our screens all day, so please phone us.
James, just one further question. Is the obligation to conduct governance reviews imposed by the code or the commission? Shall I just answer that? I mean, the code is a voluntary code for the sector, but it has been endorsed by the commission, so the commission are very keen to encourage it. It doesn't quite have the same strength as their guidance, where you need to comply or explain, essentially. But I think they would look and say, well, you're a large charity, you haven't done a governance review for however many years. Are you really taking your governance responsibilities seriously? Would you have anything to add to that, James?
No, I think that's right. And I think what we're seeing is the code moving from, an interesting document among others to one which is being complied with by more and more organizations. And you'll see more and more organizations reporting in their annual report that they do comply with the code. Some of them report that they've complied with the code and they haven't quite altogether done that, but nevertheless it is becoming more important. And as Andrew has said, the Commission fully support it and would take it as an indicator of good practice if it had been complied with.
So Rachel, if you just want to flick onto the next slide, we will be sending the slides out at the end, but there's James and me in our in real life suits. We very much look forward to hearing from you if you've got any questions. Thank you for joining us. I hope it's been useful. And as I say, I hope we'll meet you all in real life in due course. Stay safe, stay well. Thank you for joining us.
Goodbye.